fin de la session. So thank you very much, Africa Study Group, Cheickh, Bruce, Tag, for organizing this session. What I'm going to do in very quickly and briefly is talk a little bit about state fragility by focusing in particular on what we call states that are trapped. I think, as Cheickh mentioned earlier, Sudan, in our view, would certainly qualify as a country that has been trapped in fragility. And our project, the one that I'm a part of at Carleton University, has actually listed Sudan as a trapped state. And I will explain in a few minutes what this means. So we understand state fragility as a result of interrelated aspects of poverty, conflict, and stability. In our project, which is the Country Indicators for Foreign Policy project, which you can access online, and I'd be very happy to send everyone the link later on for them to look at it, and in particular the methodology and how we characterize states, how we measure, that kind of thing. We consider states, we assume that states must exhibit three fundamental properties, namely authority, legitimacy, and capacity. So these three things are, in our view, essential for a state to function properly. So what do I mean by this? Authority essentially is the ability to enact binding legislation, exercise coercive force over your territory, so having control over your territory, providing core public goods to your population, and providing a stable and secure environment to the citizens and communities in your country. Legitimacy, which is the second part of this, is the extent to which a government commands public loyalty to the governing regime, and the extent to which it can generate support for that government's legislation and policy. And finally, the third leg, if you will, of that stool is capacity, which is the ability of a state to mobilize resources and how they can employ them towards productive ends. So in a recent book that I'm going to show to you on the screen, which is Exiting the Fragility Trap, again, I can certainly send people the reference afterwards. We actually looked at a couple of trap states. Sudan was not one of the two that we studied extensively, but it was part of the quantitative analysis, if you will. The two trap states that we examined more carefully in the book were Pakistan and Yemen, which also, in our view, are states that are trapped. Sudan, again, was not part of those of the extensive case studies, but it is part of a sample of countries that are trapped. So what I'm going to do is draw a little bit from the findings of the book and relate that to the case of Sudan, right? So, if you look at the case of Sudan, our latest data that we have, which is based on 2018, actually ranks Sudan in second position in the world after Chad. So it's the second most fragile country in 2018, and that was towards the end of that year, as most of you know, the country started experiencing protests and so on, and then things unraveled in 2019. So even in 2018, when we looked at our data in the last 5 years, we could see a deterioration in authority and legitimacy in the country. Capacity was sort of volatile. It was going up and down, but it didn't move very much. It was really authority and legitimacy that were deteriorating a few years before the uprising and the coup and so on, right? So, in hindsight, you could have looked at the trajectory of Sudan in the last 4 or 5 years and perhaps even anticipated that this was about to happen, right? I would point to a report that was issued by the Institute for Security Studies as far back as 2013, where they actually looked at some projections for 26 fragile countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And Sudan actually was a country that the Institute for Security Studies expected to remain fragile even by 2050, right? So that's a long time in the future, like 30 years from now, it's expected that this is a country that will remain among 10 fragile African countries. In our study, in the book, when we looked at the factors that force countries into a trap and prevent them from building resilience and becoming stronger, there are two interesting things that we find, which I will share. One is that even as countries grow and they build capacity, it is not a guarantee that they will remain, that they will actually become less fragile. That's interesting, because basically what it tells you is that if you just focus on the economics and you try to achieve development through growth, it's not a guarantee that you will become more stable and resilient, right? What we find in our study is that there are two things that matter the most. I'm not saying that development doesn't matter, but I think development on its own will not work if these two other things don't work. So in particular, what we find is that capability or government effectiveness, you can think of that as service delivery, is really important. And then the second factor that seems to really matter is legitimacy. And we measure that in terms of voice and accountability towards people. So state-society relations are really important for countries to emerge from the trap. So that's, I just wanted to throw this out there because I think it has a lot of implications for countries such as Sudan. And let me finally conclude with a couple of things. One is, in addition to really weak authority and legitimacy, if we look at our data in terms of a breakdown into different, what I call categories or streams, if you will, the two things that were very clear to us in 2018 for Sudan is really poor governance. If you look at the ranking in terms of governance, strongly lacking. I think it won't be surprising to you that Sudan, even today, if you look at the latest ranking from Transparency International, is a lot of corruption in the country. I think it's ranked about 173rd out of 180 countries. And then there's the security and crime category, which is also a problem, right? So again, these speak to issues of capability and legitimacy as I've described them. Sudan, unfortunately, today is one of 29 low-income countries in the world. In fact, it was recently downgraded by the World Bank. It used to be a lower middle-income country. Now it's a low-income country. So when the bank did certain revisions to exchange rates, it turns out that per capita income was significantly lower than what was expected. And so it is a country that faces a number of challenges going forward. And I think, in my view, that the challenge will be going forward to actually build legitimacy and capability. So how can we, just to summarize, how can we make sure that state-society relations are rebuilt, and how can we make sure that there's proper service delivery by the government to the citizens? Because ultimately, if these two things are not present, I just don't see how you can actually transition from where you are now as a country that has recently, transitioned to a sort of, semi-military or, with a coup, and then a government now that is trying to, to build that legitimacy. You can't do that unless you have these two things, as priorities. Obviously, development has to be there. You need to have growth. You need to have economic opportunity. But I think the political side of this is really essential going forward. So I will stop here and turn it over to the next speakers. Thank you very much.
Before turning, thank you so much, thank you so much, Teddy, for this excellent presentation. You have laid the ground for the rest of the discussion. And before passing the floor to Tag, I would like to just ask you one question, because I will certainly not be able to ask some other question in the question and answer period. Nothing that a key trigger common to nearly all conflict is the element of fragility of states, of institutions, or of societies. United Nations Secretary General Guterres, and by the way, happy birthday, United Nations. United Nations Secretary General Guterres has called for increasing investment in preventive measures that address the problem of fragility before it turns into conflict. And as you know, in Africa, we have, when we say fragility, there are fragility, pre-conflictual fragility and post-conflictual fragility. And in any case, it seems that the Secretary General is encouraging people for, to address the issue of conflict, of fragility, even before it happened and leads to a conflict. In this context, the main strategy adopted by many African countries has been to undertake a reset of policies. You just mentioned it, by reset of legislation and legislation development, judiciary change, and those kind of steps. In so doing, they have often sustained that a crucial moment the international community should support, but not set policies. My question, is there an universal solution to escape the fragility trap?
Thank you, Cheickh. This is a very interesting question. As researchers, we are always interested in finding common causes, if you will, or certain sort of similarities across countries. So when we started this project, we basically divided countries into three groups: countries that are trapped, countries that move in and out, and then countries that exit and become stable. We would have liked to come up with a sort of template that countries should follow based on what I would call success stories. The reality is that it's very difficult to do that. I would argue that even among the trapped countries, in general, countries are fragile in their own ways. And I would say even when it comes to the trapped countries, they are fragile. They are trapped for specific reasons. There are similarities. And so I'm very careful when I say, I'm drawing from examples, like Yemen and Pakistan. It doesn't mean that Sudan is the same, but you do find some general patterns that emerge sometimes. And I think one of them is really that legitimacy matters. This is one, if there is one main message from our most recent book, it is about legitimacy. And I think the challenge here for international organizations like the World Bank or even at the OECD level and so on, once you start talking about legitimacy, you're talking about politics, you're talking about national sovereignty. And it becomes very difficult for international actors to enter into that space because ultimately you are getting involved more and more with politics. But I would argue that you need to do that. There's just no way if you want to build resilience that you can just ignore it. So it's more difficult. And this is perhaps why it's been so difficult for international organizations to actually engage in that space, right? So there's no template. There's no unique solution, I would say. You need to examine each country based on its context. And I think one of the other things also, which is a challenge, is what are the incentives that leaders of trapped states have to conduct reform? It's very difficult to incentivize leaders of trapped states to do anything when they're basically being supported by a narrow group of what I would call the elites, who basically have a sort of bargain with them to provide each other mutual benefits, right? So for you to break that kind of cycle is sometimes very difficult. So I always like to think about, what are the incentives that we can provide to such leaders for them to conduct reforms. And again, this is not easy, but I think there are ways in which you can target your interventions, whether through aid or other means, in order to change the incentives that leaders face to bring reforms. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Professor. Switch the floor to Doug for his presentation. You have the floor, Doug, please.
Thank you very much. And when I'm finished before Fadil takes over, Sheikh, you seem to inadvertently did not present Hashim Yusuf, who is our fourth panelist. So while I'm talking, I will appreciate it if you can dig out his introduction or get it from Bruce so that you introduce him before Fadil talks. Thank you.
Definitely, definitely. I will do that, Tak. And I'm sorry for
Okay.
that, Tak. I was going to do it, but I will do it now. We have Mr. Hashim Ismaili, an international development consultant with extensive experience in community development and the empowerment of women and youth. He has an MP in international affairs from the Norman Patterson School of International Affairs. It was my mistake. I apologize. And actually, he is somehow the heart of this session because he's going to talk about the youth. And that's very, very important. That's the youth is the future of democracy and the future of Sudan. And it's very important that we can listen to him today. It was my mistake that I forgot to introduce him. Thank you.
That's okay. You have also disabled participants' screen sharing. So if you please release me and let me share the screen, I will appreciate it.
It's in the hand of Bruce. I have no
yeah.
idea how to do this. I am just monitoring here, and somehow it's in the hand of Bruce. So Bruce, if you can please do something there. Hello? If somebody from Bruce, if you can hear me or Sam,
I can hear it. It's
I will maybe ask you to do something there. Otherwise, I will encourage you. I will ask you to start your presentation. Meanwhile, I believe that Bruce will be working on this issue. If you can just start your presentation, please.
Okay. Now I am screen sharing. Do you see me? Do you see the frame?
I can see it, Tag. I hope Sheikh can.
I can see it.
Okay, right. I'm going to do some analysis, then talk a little bit about fragility. Then I will go into nation building and resilience. Ethnically, the Sudan is ethnically a heterogeneous country. There are over 60 ethnic groups, tribes, languages in Sudan. And along the years, the Nile Valley, where most of the development happened before independence and after independence, they had their share of more than their fair share of development and of power. And the rural areas of Sudan, the east and the west, were greatly disadvantaged. That's sad because Sudan is not a new country. It was not made by colonial invasion and disinvasion. It dates back to the Mesolithic area and into the Neolithic era. This is 7,000 to 5,000 years BC. And they continued into the Neolithic, which is 5,000 to 3,000 BC. And then the great civilization of Karma came around 2,500 BC to 1,500 BC. And it peaked between 1785 and 1,500 BC. This is when the 25th dynasty of the Black Pharaohs actually ruled all over Egypt up to the Delta. And they scared away the Assyrians, and Taharka, one of their kings, is mentioned in the Bible in 2 Kings 19:9 and Isaiah 37:9. And then the Arab Abdullah, together with Sinar Funj, they conquered Soba, kingdom. When they conquered it, it had 400 great churches, and they were a Christian kingdom. And then they continued to rule until 1821, which is the invasion of Muhammad Ali Pasha, who was in charge of Egypt on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. The elites of the Central Valley, while they were able to establish a state, they failed miserably in establishing a nation. And social entities. They are not a nation state. This is not Portugal, it is not Bangladesh, where Bengal are majority, it is not Japan, it is not Albania. So we do have a state, but do not have a nation, the control of the central government in Khartoum. And notably, we're talking about
Hamoudi?
Go ahead.
Tag he has been cut off. He may have to be rebooted. That may be what he's doing.
Yeah, I think that's what happened.
Yeah, so it's not from me, I think it's from their side.
Unmute. Tag, you're still muted.
We can still see Tag's screen, but we cannot see Tag. I don't know if he's still online.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Back to work.
East Sudan is a place now, and there is a duel getting fairly serious between the Bija cluster, which are the majority and the indigenes of the area, and the Habab and the Bani Amir tribes, who actually originate from Eritrea, and they speak the Tigrinya language rather than Balawid language of Eastern Sudan. And the sense of identity is still deeply entrenched in tribalism. The first coup d'etat in Sudan, it was a very strange coup d'etat where the incumbent democratically elected government actually called the army to take over for political reasons. And in those days, nobody looked down upon a military coup of that nature, to the extent that the leader of the coup, General Ibrahim Aboud, was gracefully met by John F. Kennedy in the White House and in Buckingham Palace by Queen Elizabeth II. The first uprising was October 21st of October 1964, where the Islamist leader Hassan al-Turabi was supposed to speak at the University of Khartoum to talk about the rebellion in South Sudan by the Anania movement. And a student who was not really politically engaged threw a stone at a police officer, and the police officer shot back, and the student was killed. That was the trigger. If the student was not there or the shot did not kill him, God knows what would have happened, because it was not really ripe and ready for an uprising. And I have a clear distinction between uprising and revolution, which I will come to later on. Was 1964 a revolution? I doubt very much, because a revolution has got to have change, both constitutional and in reforming the legislative and the executive and improving people's lives along the lines of people's demand. That one did not work, and the second coup was on May 25th, 1965 by then Officer Jaffer Nimeri. So just 5 years between 1964 and 1969, and another coup d'etat had to come in. There was lack of basic commodities during the end of the days of Nimeri, and Nimeri enacted harsh Islamic rules. And by the way, Sharia in Arabic means rules. So Islamic Sharia laws is you are double stating. So it's either Sharia or Islamic laws. And he abrogated the 1972 agreement that brought peace between the North and the South and ended the first civil war. Compared to 1964, this uprising was relatively better organized. And a transitional military council was made up of officers who sided with the people. And right on time, they went back to their barracks, and there was another civilian government ruling Sudan. The second uprising was started around May 27th, around May 83, with massive support from Colonel Mengistu in South Sudan. He supported the new movement in South Sudan, but the North was also becoming a little bit agitated and tired of Nimeri because he enacted the Sharia laws and he started to behave like a dictator. A few tangible policies were implemented during the 4 years of tranquility and democratic rule between 1985 and 1989, when the junta again sprang on power through a military stark coup d'etat on June 30th, 1989. And it was not without casualties and loss of life. And then we have our main concern now, which is the third uprising. Those two was really to give you a kind of background. There was severe economic hardships, fuel stations experienced long queues, there was no bread, there was no cooking gas, and inflation rose from 50% up to 50%. Today, the inflation is 212%. The rate of exchange in those days was 3 times the official rate. The protests were igniting in on December 19th, 2018. In 1 week, serious demonstrations erupted in Roseris, Sinar, Port Sudan, Al Ubaid, and almost across the main rural urban areas of Sudan, with a very interesting chanting logo, "Tasgud best," or "you just go down." That was it. They just didn't want to see Bashir anymore. And then on April 11th, 2019, the Sudanese armed forces sided with the demonstrations, removed Bashir from office, arrested him, and put him in jail while he is still there. Divergence from this one and the 1985 one is that the uprising was mostly mobilized and supported by youth of under 30 years of age. Even school kids, 17, 18 years, knew what was going on. They went out in the street, they were shot and they were killed. And they paid for the uprising with their blood. Another divergence is that the uprising was from 1985, with the considerable loss of life, killed by live ammunition, and the investigation is still going on, and God knows why it has taken so long to find out who the perpetrators was. But the dramatic divergence is that the head of state, Omar al-Bashir, was removed, arrested, and imprisoned. This did not happen to Nimeria, and this did not happen to the leaders of the first coup of 1958. June 3rd, 2019 was really a climax of the uprising when the armed security forces opened fire on the demonstrators and hundreds were killed. Was it an uprising? Certainly, 100%. Was it a revolution? As far as I can see it, as a political analyst, that is doubtful. Getting rid of a dictator without implementing a political project that brings about positive change in the lives of citizens can hardly be called a revolution. As we speak, inflation rose from 57% to 212%. The Sudanese pound fell from 50 pounds to the dollar to 260 pounds to the dollar. The national debt is almost double the gross domestic product at $60 billion. The balance of trade is on the red with $4 billion. And now the IMF agreed with the government of Sudan, because they don't have capacity. They have organized a 12-month term of what they call a staff monitor program. That means a team from the IMF is going to be stationed in Khartoum, literally looking and analyzing every penny being spent. Then the government in Khartoum decided to do an economic conference to see if they can have some recommendations. It was a fiasco. There was naming and blaming and insults. And at the end of the 3 days, 160 recommendations were issued. God knows how long it will take any government, competent or not, to implement 160 recommendations. Right now, with the fiasco and the insecurity and the incompetence of governance, it is doubtful that anybody will take his money and go and invest in Sudan. People are talking about resources. Yes, there are resources. But the mega resources of the world are actually in the deep oceans. How can they be reached? How can you change resources into viable business opportunities? Investors do not go after the resources. Investors go after opportunities. The security is poor. The rule of law is not observed. Citizens, due to the weakness of the government and its incompetence, are taking the law into their hands. Protests by standing have become the norm. Whoever has a claim, they do a sitting or standing protest. About 6 or 7 months back, we had an event here in Ottawa, and an expert from Carleton Center from Washington, D.C. He came to co-present with us. And when I talked about Sudan has reached a stage of compassion fatigue, he said, no, it is not compassion fatigue, it is Sudan fatigue, because only bad news come from Sudan. And I'm quoting him here. Peace is in limbo. And after 1 year of discussions in Juba in South Sudan, it was noted that there were 98 different Darfur movements, 98 different Darfur movements from one region. Quite a bit of a struggle. Finally, they have an agreement. I checked the implementation matrix, which is an integral part of any agreement. How do you implement what has been agreed? And it is undoable. It cannot be implemented on the ground. And I was an actor and a very active expert in the CPA of 2005, and it took us 4 months to draft a doable implementation agreement, and that's what made the agreement work. Regrettably separated South Sudan, but that's what the people wanted. And the separation of South Sudan in 2011 actually dealt a big blow to Sudan, because South Sudan went away with 350,000 barrels per day of oil production, 10 million citizens, and about 620,000 kilometers of land, which was our depths and connection with Africa. And people were dreaming when when there was peace in 2005 and Garang was coming to Khartoum. I recall, it must have been 2001 or so, when I saw John Garang in a hotel in Addis Ababa, and I asked him why he was talking about the one Sudan. And his response was very interesting. He said, Taj, Colonel Mengistu gives me from the needle to the tank, and he developed Gambela Airport to land the Illusion planes with my supplies. He's fighting the separatist war against the Eritrean rebels. How can I advocate for separation? John Garang was using the unity of Sudan, tactical and not strategic. The government of Khartoum now needs to face the hard realities. And as Teddy said, Sudan has been trapped in fragility for 20 years. And fragility is measured by the performance of the trio: authority, legitimacy, and capacity. Indicators of legitimacy are gender, empowerment, level of democracy, participation, international political organizations, performance of regime type, among others. And indicators of capacity are education, primary completion of females, foreign aid percentage to expenditure, among other parameters. This will be recorded, and if you want this presentation later on and you ask for it, you can get it. Now, when you have a situation like Sudan, your starting point will be your peace and stability goals. And peace and stability goals, this was developed by the G7 plus other countries. And you need a body like the World Bank or the African Development Bank to work on that. When the war ended in 2005 in South Sudan, there was a multi-donor trust fund established. 7 states, 15 projects, total of about $600 million, and 7 countries, including Sudan. Canada's role was they donated 7% of the total portfolio, and they were the whistleblower when the World Bank did not really manage the projects very well. The cost effectiveness, which is how much money went into management and how much money went into projects, was extremely poor. I know the details of that because I was the team leader of the evaluation of the multi-donor trust fund in Northern Sudan. A very good report was written about that experience, about 100 pages. It is available if anybody wants it. And in South Sudan, there was a parallel but different multi-donor trust fund of $728 million managed by the World Bank, 14 donors, and Canada donated 8% of the portfolio. I was involved in that, but I was not the team leader then. Now, to conclude the final point, what can be done? I mean, it is very good to do the diagnosis and carry on what is negative, but that's not going to help Sudan. I think what is needed is a multilateral and global funding rather than the jokes that are happening now of people assembling and dispersing. It must be at arm's length from the government of Sudan. maybe about $3 billion, with at least $1 billion going into capacity building, because that's the black hole. That's really a very big gap. People who are competent in Sudan, people who could get things done, have left the country. That's the fact. Others are frustrated and onlookers standing at the fence. This will require probably 4 or 5 years of implementation, not because the need is that elastic, but because of the local absorption capacity. There is no absorption capacity for more than that money in Sudan today. Okay, Sudan now, I helped develop this concept of peace and peace stabilizing goals for South Sudan. I was not a team leader, but I had a good contribution in developing the concept and doing the study. When you have a situation like Sudan, Sudan is not in crisis with an IS. Sudan is in crisis with an ES. It is not one crisis. And what you need to start with is legitimate politics. Sudan is at the crisis stage in this one. Security is extremely poor in Sudan. They are at the crisis stage. Justice is a little bit from the 0 bar because there is an effort. However, the number of cases, if you look, stare at someone in the street, he is going to take you to court. There is so much overload on the justice system, God knows if they can take it. Economic foundations are collapsing or collapsed. Revenue and services have collapsed. Now, when you have this kind of study, the country needs to move from crisis to rebuild and reform, because right now there is almost total collapse and there is need for rebuilding and reforming. The next stage will be transition from this horrible situation into the future. The next step is transformation into control, production, and some stability. Only then can we have resilience. And resilience is that additional capacity in storage, political capital, social capital, economic capital, that is in reserve, so that if there is nature-made or man-made crisis, then people can resort to it so that the country and the people do not suffer. This is a long way, and we wish Sudan all the best. Thank you.
I think tag is Bruce. I think Cheickh had to go out, so perhaps Fadl could start his presentation.
Okay.
So you should turn off your video.
Yep.
Okay, can you hear me and see me?
Yes, that's good.
Okay. Well, good evening to everybody. And thanks to the African group for organizing this webinar. And I hope it's going to benefit everybody, and hope it will benefit Sudan at the end, and the people who are working to make things better in it. I'm going to speak about Sudan foreign policy, its past, its present, and the future. And I'll try my best to link it as much as possible to the question of resilience and to the revolution or the uprising of December 19. When the British colonizers departed Sudan in 1956, despite the landmines and hotbeds and conflicts they left behind lingering, they left a resilient, unified, stable state that enjoyed a considerable extent of development in terms of good governance, excellence in infrastructure and services, including education. The positive legacy was reflected in all aspects of life, and it was manifested in the institutions and the individuals who managed them not only because of the superior education and training they received, but also because of the work ethics instilled in them. With regard to foreign policy, the country lived through an era during which its leaders were appreciated and respected by the world, and they were received with reverence wherever they went. Likewise, Sudan was visited by numerous heads of states, and that devolved down to subsidiary echelons and officials in governments to the benefit of Sudan. As for the foreign affairs ministers, this key position was held by highly qualified national figures and personalities. They were supported by skillful, highly competent diplomats at the headquarters and abroad. Having on top competent and capable ministers assisted by reliable staff, Sudan foreign policy in those golden covenants was totally the affair of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and it indeed delivered. Sudan had a proportionally decent place on the international arena, and it became an important figure within its region and the regional group to which it belongs, the African Union, the Arab League, and the Islamic Organization. Sudanese diplomacy had its successes and shining moments. To mention but few, Sudan had a prominent presence in the Bandung Conference in April 1955 and the 1961 Belgrade Conference, in which an aligned movement was formed. It was diplomatically and militarily present during the short-lived Iraqi crisis in 1961. It played the main role in bringing the Arab factions together after the defeat of 1967 and reaching the three Khartoum no's, now the three Khartoum yeses. Its opinion was sought and its advice was taken with regard to various conflicts in its neighboring countries or regional circles. Though major components and essential ingredients in the field of foreign affairs, which are vision and strategy that would be continuously refined and defined and its tool sharpened, were missing. Towards the end of the era of President Nimeri, conditions began to deteriorate in all walks of life. The Foreign Service was not spared. Though things did not reach their lowest possible point and hit rock bottom, till power in Sudan was snatched in 1989 by Muslim Brotherhood led by General Omar al-Bashir, who ruled and ruined the country for over a period of 30 years. I will need 9 hours, not 9 minutes, to tell but a small part of the damage al-Bashir regime inflicted on Sudan foreign policy and relations. Here are some examples. He, meaning al-Bashir, and many of his aides were and still wanted by ICC, International Criminal Court. That not only make them prisoners in their own country, but also reduced them to crippled lot, indeed a liability when it came to foreign affairs. The responsibility of making and executing Sudan foreign policy was relocated to the Republic Palace, the Council of Ministers, the Security Service, and the ruling party. There were many kitchens, and each kitchen there were many chefs. At the time when the world was coming together to fight global terrorism, the regime made Sudan a pariah state and Khartoum the capital of terrorism, and Sudan was not only a safe haven and a breeder of terrorism and terrorists, but its then regime granted them diplomatic passports and immunity that granted them cover and ease of movement. Sudanese people are still paying the hefty price of that. As for the strategy and goals of foreign policy, the regime believed that it had a divine mission, which was restoring to Islam its glory and making it the faith of earth. The regime conducted a foreign policy that was partially responsible for losing a dear part of Sudan, and it is making it till now susceptible for further fragmentation and for losing its sovereignty over some of its territories. From top to bottom, the regime infested the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and embassies with those who are loyal to it, not those who are capable and qualified, and the list goes on and on and on. Moving to the present and pondering the future, December 18 uprising was a great and important event for which the Sudanese people paid a dear price and on which they laid as much hopes as they paid. The world watches the uprising with interest and admiration, which is success and expressed readiness to support it. Though we need to help ourselves so others can help us. We are not doing that yet. Despite the fact that despite the fact the former regime left the country ailing when it comes to foreign relations and in desperate need for all kinds of help to deal with its domestic woes, and despite the fact that all the givens indicated Sudan needed a competent minister to head the ministry, correct its past, rebuild it from ground up, Sudan foreign policy is not seen by current leaders as a priority, to the extent that till now there is no appointed foreign minister, and the former minister was not of the magnitude and caliber of the challenges and ambitions of how Sudan foreign policy should be now and in the future. Conducting foreign policy and making it viable and fruitful is becoming more complex and difficult. This has been augmented by the increase in isolationist tendencies and the COVID-19 crisis, which is with its haunting impacts on donors and recipients as well. On the other hand, today the world is not the two-border universe it used to be. The major players keep changing, and so do the rules of the game. The world concerns in the era of globalization are not limited anymore to politics and weapons, as issues of climate, technology, human rights, dignity, gender equality, and others are becoming increasingly prominent. A must-have strategy for Sudan foreign policy needs to be more focused, identifying what we want, from where we can get it and how, and what price we are willing to pay. For this, we need all the components to be in place: the vision, the strategy, the institutions, the tools, and the personnel. We need to be proactive and on top of a tough game. Though, before and above all that, we need to build a resilient Sudan with people unified in ranks and goals. A failed state will produce nothing but a failed foreign policy that will not generate sympathy or warrant respect, neither will it beget any help. In conclusion, I add that it is about time that Sudan foreign policy and domestic policies aim at freeing the country from continuing to be dependent on others. This does not always come free or cheap, nor will it build a state with a free will and sovereignty. With its enormous wealth and resources and vast capabilities, Sudan is able to raise its head, stand on its own feet, and begin its noble march toward peace, security, prosperity, and earning a decent place in our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure, Cheickh was disconnected, and I don't know if he's able to come back and continue his sharing. You are.
Yes, I'm back now. I'm sorry. I apologize, and my internet is very, very unstable today.
Okay, Cheickh,
so I am on the phone right now.
I was going to just suggest, if I was going to take over, so I'll suggest it anyway, that before you turn it over to the last speaker, that if anybody wishes to submit questions, some of you have been submitting questions, please use the Q&A function to do so before we move to the Q&A period after Hashim Ismail's presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Bruce. I apologize again. My internet, as I say, is providing a very unstable way today, and I'm on the phone, but I believe I will be able to continue the session. I will pass the floor now to our last presenter, who is Mr. Hashim Ismaili. Hashim, I apologize again that I omitted to introduce you. I don't know what happened, but I even wanted to start by you. I apologize, but Ismaili. And I will just switch the floor to you, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you to the African Study Group and NPSIA and to all my professors here for giving me this opportunity to participate in this presentation, this webinar about Sudan. And I think I'm gonna start, I'll thank Prof. Teddy for explaining explaining the country indicators for foreign policy and how they assess the fragility. Because I need to highlight here in a work that I did with two of my colleagues at the Norman Patterson School when we assess Sudan fragility, and we produce a Sudan fragility report that published by the CIFP, and I can post it here later. And the most interesting things on this assessment is that it allows us like to assess the Sudan fragility from different angles, and also give us explanation why Sudan trapped for all this long time in fragility. And we use the ELC assessment to identify areas of governance that weakest Sudan, and also we use the SIPs to assess the different areas. So I'm just gonna briefly show what we found through this report. When we assess Sudan, we found that there is a primary and secondary drivers for Sudan fragility. The primary drivers, we found that weak governance, fragile economy, and environmental pressures, those are the main drivers. Also, those affect the secondary drivers, which is the security, human development, and demography. And when we use the ALC, the authority, legitimacy, and capacity, we found that Sudan ranks poorly in all of them. But we found that the weak legitimacy has resulted in several security concerns that weakens the state's authority, and also the capacity affected by the weak legitimacy, which is corruptions and unequal distribution of resources. So I think this is when Professor Teddy mentioned that, like, when you tackle the fragility or the country fragility, you have to look at all of these areas, and legitimacy in terms of Sudan are the main drivers for this, with the capacity. So, and it need like it's a long journey, like, to lift Sudan from the trap, and as they said, it need almost another 30 years to lift Sudan from the trap. But through this report, we found that some suggestions that might help the government and Sudan to restore stability in the country. And we came up with some policies that might help the government, because we came up with the scenarios too, that if the government didn't tackle the interim government, if they fail to tackle some of the issues, country might collapse. And just to mention, Sudan population is almost a little bit over 40 million, and the youth below 24 years old represent over 60% of the population, and the youth below 29 represent almost 68 to 69%. So Sudan is the youthful country. It's a young country, and the youth bulge theory mentioned that any country have over 10% from its population. If they are youth, they will cause the social unrest. And we've seen that now during this government. We see the youth are not happy until now with the interim government performance, because they have a clear demand that freedom, peace, and justice. They asking the government to reform the economy and also bring justice to those who killed during the protest and the genocide happening in Darfur, and also to stabilize the country and bring the peace. And we see like the main reason is the economic, still country in economic crisis. And one thing that I need to mention through tight presentations, that the three uprising in Sudan, they have main drivers, which is the economic crisis. When the prices of the bread and the fuel increased in 60s, youth went to protest, and this is happening in 85 and also happened now. Despite that, we have other issues like human resource and rule of law. So I think the main challenge now for this government is how to restore the economy of the country and build the institutional, and also bring those to the justice. And I think from a youth perspective, I see that still there is some work to be done related to the youth, especially in like improving the relation between the government and the civil society organizations. And we've seen that still there is laws that imposed from the past regime restrict the civil society organization from working well on the ground. And I think this lifting the laws and regulation that affected the CSOs will help like the government, the weak institutional of the government, that they can reach most of the country, will help those organizations to reach areas that government unable to reach. And we have an example in the past crisis, the flood crisis happening in Sudan. We saw youth initiatives and civil society are the front lines. They very quick respond to the crisis and were able to do the needs analysis and collect data, and helping the foreign aids that coming through this crisis to be distributed well. And because the government institutions are very weak and were not able to respond to this crisis. Also, other things that still youth faces in Sudan, the unemployment rate is increasing, and it is really high. And when we look at other area that possible for youth to tackle this for youth, is that to enhance the policies and regulation affected business establishment in Sudan. And Sudan ranked poorly on the countries that to establish a business, and it takes months and months, and you have to bribe to get the paper done. So I think the government, if they enhance this area and promote the social entrepreneurships, also this is one of the solutions for the youth of Sudan now. Another thing in the peace processes, we see that youth were excluded from the peace negotiation and all the process of the negotiation until the signing the agreement. And still we don't know too much about this, but it's very important, and there is a time to include youth and women as an observer to safeguard this peace agreement. And I have a bit concerns here, because in this agreement I saw that the government committed to pay $7.5 billion within 10 years. which means $750 million every year as a development in the area that affected by war. And my concern that the government now is like they fail to just secure less than 300 million for medicines, and how they gonna like secure all this amount of money for 10 years. This is a question need to be answered. And also another solution that you are looking for, we know that Sudan, 80% of the population of Sudan rely on the agricultures, and access to the microfinance and macro loans, it's very difficult in Sudan, and it's only affordable for the rich people in Sudan. So creating an agribusiness mechanism that offer microfinance and micro loans to youth and women in rural areas, that will help like to tackle some of the economical problem that face it, and also facing the climate change. And when we look at this from a Canadian perspective, I see that like Canadian government can help in a way or another in tackling these issues. And I see that Canada can help Sudan through different areas, but I just have a few areas that seems like it's very important, like the technical support by building institutions in Sudan. And here mainly I'm looking for Central Bureau of Statistics and the revenue agencies in Sudan. You see, Stats Canada, like it's can support like the Central Bureau of Statistics in Sudan, because I remember the Minister of Social Development and Labor, it's complaining that there is a big problem in generating data and analyzing data, and this due to the lack of good institutions and lack of the skills, technical skills. So I think Canada can help in this area in building institutions, especially those Central Bureau of Statistics. Also a revenue agency, like also the Prime Minister mentioned many times that the Sudan, one of the lowest country in generating taxes, and I think those areas can help the government first, like to put a map for the development based on data, and based on actual data, not like just guessing, and also helping them to generate the taxes or build a taxation system that help the government in find a way of generate revenues. I think I'll stop here because my time is off, and then we can elaborate later in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hashim. And I have conflicting messages from Cheickh, whether he is back or not. We're now moving into the Q&A period. Cheickh, are you there, or do you want me to try and manage the questions and answers?
Yes, I am here. I have answered quite a number of questions in writing.
That simplifies our work for sure. And yeah, people can look at the comments and the question and the answers you've given to see the answers to that. Cheickh, are you? Sorry, not Cheickh. Yeah, Cheickh, as opposed to Tag. Are you there or not? If not, I will sort of proceed to try and manage Q's and A's for the just as we come towards the end of the meeting. First, thank you very much, Hashim, for an interesting perception of the priorities of the youth of Sudan. I thought that was very interesting for all of us old people. Cheickh? Okay.
Yeah, Bruce, I'm still here, but my internet is very unstable. It's just being cut. I would suggest that you continue, please, because we want some continuity on this session.
Okay, I think.
I apologize.
Thanks very much, Cheickh. I think Tag has actually answered in writing a number of questions about the in particular about the general, who I assume is heavily involved, General Dagalo. There was a question about whether he was likely to be the next president. And I guess so. Maybe you could offer for people a little bit of a comment on his personality as a first question. Tag?
Yeah, just a sec. I am having a little bit of trouble here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I put my mute on. I better leave it off.
Right. I don't think that he will be the next president or head of a transitional military council for a number of reasons. Number one, he's what we call a Bush general, B-U-S-H. He did not go to a military academy, so he's not a career soldier or a career officer in the proper sense, where he studied his strategies, where he had a post-secondary or even secondary education. He did not even finish his intermediate education. So that capacity, that intellectual capacity is not there. But this is not the main reason. The main reason is that Sudan armed forces, the proper army, are 240,000 strong, according to the military balance of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And they are still, though weak, but they are still an intact force. So from a number of personnel point of view, they are the fourth largest army in Africa of all the 54 or 55 countries, if we take Sahara into consideration. And his forces, the rapid deployment forces that are managed by Delego, they were a ragtag of people collected and paid and quickly trained and put on these Toyota pickups. So their maximum estimated number is 36,000, and generally acceptable is about 25,000. So they're quite a force, but they are not a match at all to the Sudan armed forces. They will not stand for a few hours. So he wouldn't dare, and they wouldn't dare stage a coup unless they have the proper staff, the 240,000 strong army behind them. And I don't think that is going to happen. I don't think that a career officer like Al-Burhan or his colleagues are going to accept the leadership of somebody who did not even finish his intermediate school and who is a Bush general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tag. I'm just looking, I think you have basically answered all the questions that I see. Okay, we have the one from Marsha. So with the massive challenges facing the transition government of Sudan, what do you see as the first thing that a government should try to attack? Maybe Tag and then El Fadl and...
The first thing they need to do really is to look inwards rather than outwards. I mean, these guys, as soon as the uprising succeeded and Bashir was down and put in jail, the majority of the people in the country, including the politicians, including the army, they saw that the whole world is going to come running and reward Sudan for the success of the uprising. The world does not work like that. The world looks with interest. Politics are about, if there is no interest, there is very little charity in there. Charity is done through bilateral efforts, and the world has bailed out the people that were affected by the floods. So that did not happen. So the first thing that they really need to do is to turn around and look inwards. Second thing is, nobody is working in Sudan. There is no production. The local production is extremely poor. And unless the people pull up their trousers and they start working and start producing, start improving the gross domestic product, Start working on reducing the national debt. Start reducing the inflation rate. I mean, that requires hard work, and this is not about money, because money will come in and it is not sustainable. If you give $1, you are not going to get $1 tomorrow. And as I mentioned before, there is not only donor fatigue, there is now compassion fatigue other than lip service. Lip service does not help. So that the solution lies internally, and the solution lies in pulling up people's trousers, government and people, to start producing and depending on themselves.
Thank you, Tag. I think that I see two questions. So that one is for Hashim. The other one I'll probably back to you, Tag, but I'll start with Hashim. From Nahid Abu Bakr, Ustaz Hashim mentioned few steps towards addressing fragility. Don't you think the first step for Sudanese people to develop tribal resilience, as the way we see it now, Sudanese people don't accept each other? So I guess this is an issue, if I understand that question, it's about the extent to which the people in Sudan as it now exists, as opposed to prior to South Sudan's independence, see themselves as, I mean, they're not all the same ethnic group or language or anything like that, but are they willing to continue to live together and actually then work to develop the challenges that Tag just mentioned? So I'm asking this to Hashim, Tag, so you don't have to answer it right away.
I think I'll just try to, as much as possible, to answer. But when you look at Sudan conflicts, you see most of the conflicts based on scarcity of resources, like land and water. And this is like what happening in Darfur, like the origin of the conflict is for resources. And this is because the absence of the federal government or the government in general in the past decades, from just concentrate in the center of Sudan and forgetting the rural areas. So it is the conflict now. Now we have some conflict is, for example, the one in the eastern of Sudan now between the tribes. If we look at the roots of that problem, it's about like development and the power. So if the government was able like to have an equal distribution of the resources in all of the Sudan and focus on the education and health, and also like to reform the economy, I think people in Sudan is known that like non-violence, but when it came to the resources, then anyone like go back to their tribes, you know. And also there's other things, like if we see how this is started, also there's politicians also as part of putting the fuel on the tribe things, as we see now, like the fight between the generals and the civilians component in the government. So I think it is the root cause of this are the resources. I hope I answered the question.
Muted myself. The other question that I was, and I think that hasn't, is George Jacoby's question, which is this is certainly for Tag. He once gave a presentation to the ASG on this. Sudan's interest in Ethiopia's Grand Renaissance Dam, and what's the possibility of Sudan mediating between Egypt and Ethiopia, despite the damaging comments from President Trump about Egypt destroying the dam?
Hello, George. Yes. This requires a session on its own.
Well, already, Tag.
Yeah, Sudan's interest in Ethiopia, it is not really interest. Sudan is a partner, and repeatedly when they sobered up, they said, "Look, we are not mediating. We are part of the trio," because the longest run of the Nile, the longest run of the Blue Nile, is actually in Sudan. And the second largest power generating dam in Sudan is at the onset of the Blue Nile when it enters Sudan. So if anything happens to the GERD, that dam is gone. Trump was a bully. Trump was extremely uncivilized, really, when he passed this comment that if the Egyptians bombard the dam, nobody's going to blame them. And I would suggest that you read the strong response from Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed yesterday and today, and from Foreign Affairs. The Ethiopians are close to 110 million people, and the dam is not owned by the Ethiopian government. The dam is owned by the people because they issued bonds, and it is built. The $4.5 billion that is building the dam has been contributed through bonds by the Ethiopian people. So it is no longer a government project. Sudan right now is weak in government, is weak in the international arena. Not only that, they are extremely weak in hydropolitics and hydropolicies, and these are two different domains of hydrology. All those who know what the GERD is and who know the Nile waters well are either not there or they're standing at the fence, and I'm one of them. I did do a presentation for the Africa Study Group before, and we are going to do something on Ethiopia, hopefully, in the very near future. But I don't see Sudan as mediating. The problem now with the weakness of Sudan, they are being pulled right and left, one time by Egypt and one time by Ethiopia. Both countries are far stronger in population, in gross domestic product, in internal politics and internal problems. And Egypt tries to pull Sudan to his side, and Ethiopia tries to pull Sudan to his side. Now, the storage that has been done so far is 4.7 billion cubic meters of water. When the dam is full, and I have got news now, the Ethiopians are going to speed up the filling of the dam to 79 billion cubic meters of water. If the Egyptians dare to bombard the dam, that bulk of water flowing on the Blue Nile will take everything, will wipe out everything in southern Blue Nile, and it will destroy each and every dam along the Nile, including the Aswan High Dam. So the Egyptians will not dare to do that, and they are extremely competent in hydropolitics and hydropolicies. And I was a contributing party to an event about a week or 10 days back, hosted by the Egyptian ambassador in Ottawa. And we did talk quite a bit about that. And I think now they are considering what we call independent mediation, not to be proposed by Egypt or the states, but independent mediation to be agreed upon by both parties. And I think this is where the real problem lies. Egypt, Trump said what he said, and you know, he's a bully, and I don't think he has a clue what the dam is, or what the resources are, or what are the tools in each country. Egypt certainly does not want to lose Ethiopia, does not want to push Ethiopia to the corner. And Ethiopia is armed to its teeth, and they have just placed very large orders worth about, the figure I have is $1,400,000 of armaments. And they have already put their batteries about the dam. So, one final point. The father and mother of the Nile Basin Initiative, if you remember, George, is actually Canada. And there was an engineer by the name of Ali Shadi who had that file. And in 1990 to 1992, we were the ones who came up with the principle of benefits and rights. Certainly the rights of the water are in Ethiopia, because 86% of the Nile discharge is coming from Ethiopia, out of 85 billion cubic meters. 86% generates in Ethiopia. They cannot look at the water going away, and they cannot build the dam. And Trump's position is really bad, because the 30th president, Coolidge, he wanted to fund and finance and build that dam for the Ethiopians, before the Second World War broke out in 1938. So I don't see Sudan mediating. They have vested interest and they are a party. And we need to think outside the box to have a mediation process. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think I have one. I'm trying to sort of look. I think a lot of the questions have been dealt with, but I have one here that is sort of it's a bit of an open box, but it would allow each of you, if you have something to say, maybe, and including Teddy, perhaps. It says from Nahid Abu Bakr again, in the absence of a good education, how would one be able to establish legitimacy and good governance in a fragile country? And I think like that's sort of a sufficiently generic question that maybe each of the panelists, if they wish, could offer a comment. And that would be a way of bringing, we've now done over an hour and a half. So I think we, on a Saturday night, we have done a respectable job of the very important subject, and thanking all the participants. So with that, maybe starting with Teddy, since you're the expert on fragility, what do we do when we don't have a high level of general education?
So thank you for the question. I think you can still build legitimacy as, concurrently with people. I don't know what the data is exactly on education, but I don't see any reason why you can't build legitimacy, because ultimately it is about building, stronger relationships between the government and the citizens. And that can take many forms. I mean, one of it is really ensuring that people are provided the necessary services, and that people can trust the government. I think part of this is related to a question that was asked earlier. I don't think anyone actually answered it, which was, can you explain why Sudan is poor? It's a very difficult question to answer, but I think, at least in my mind, some of the reasons would be that for a very long time you had regimes that were investing massively in military security to protect their own interests, and they never actually ensured a fair distribution of resources, which I believe Hashim mentioned earlier. And so when you combine that with high levels of corruption, you never build trust with people, and that's a recipe for disaster in my mind. So, I always go back to this issue of legitimacy and ensuring that people have trust in the government. And the way you do that is you provide them something in return, which is basic services, public goods, or even security and order. But really, it's about building trust. Thank you.
Sorry, I muted myself. Hashim, why don't you take the subject next?
Yeah, if I need to add to that is when we did the analysis for Sudan is that we found the legitimacy in Sudan is historically low, like it's not just now or during the past regime, and also you have the corruptions and the lack of distribution of resources and the civil war that's happening. So there's many reasons that like weaken the legitimacy of Sudan. And also like in this report, when we talk about how to build the legitimacy, is that to, as we said, Prof. Teddy said, like the state-society relation, like to strengthen the social contract and build the trust between the people and the leaders of the country. And in that report, I'm going to share it here. We suggest that ways that government can help the government in improve the legitimacy through community-based microfinance system, build resilience to climate change shock, because environmental issues, one of the primary drivers of the fragility in Sudan. Also, we talked about the peace. Before peace, we talk also about the anti-corruption, the corruptions that and nepotism in Sudan. So anti-corruption commission, we have now a commission, but I think there is many questions about this commission and mistakes. And in the beginning of this commission, there was 2 judges who resigned from this commission because they don't follow the judiciary system. And I think the government or Hamdok, they need to look again to this, reform this commission so that can work well in ending corruptions. Also through, and as I said, like include in this, like the civil society was excluded from the peace negotiation, and I hope the government will include them like include them still, like to be like as a safeguard, you know, on this peace agreement between the both parties, because you can't like have an agreement and the main component like the youth and women who brought this revolution or brought those to the government, to exclude them from here. And I think like in improving the work of the civil society organizations also will help to build their resilience. Other thing is that I need just the last things to mention also. We have seen that the international community is still, this is a government that by the choice of people, let's say, like to lead this transitional period, still the international community don't have the confidence to deal directly with the government in terms of aid. So how are you gonna, how they're gonna work with them in terms of business? So that means the government need to strengthen the laws and regulation, you know, and give more room to the civil society organization, especially like also the aid transparency, and also helping those organizations moving from like from humanitarian aid to the development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hashim. Tag, I'm going to let you have the last word. So I was going to ask Fadl to maybe say what his perceptions are on the foreign policy in broader sense, and then you can, as our chief Sudan expert at the Africa Study Group, we're happy to give you the last word.
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to comment on the very good question asked by Nahid about what role education can play and how education is important. I believe in a country like Sudan that is not very homogeneous, and as somebody indicated minutes ago, that people don't like each other very much, and to be able to address so many questions, ethnic questions, social questions, education is very important. If you educate people, they will be more tolerant of each other. They will be more productive. They will be less vulnerable to being used and abused by militias, by local leaders. So I think education, like so many countries, I take the example of Malaysia, when they wanted to rebuild the country, when they wanted to start advancing along a path of development, prosperity, they started with education. So education is really a prerequisite, and it is very important, and it is where we should start with addressing many issues: economical, social, the question of peace, the question of development, the question of equality among gender. All these questions can be addressed through education and can be solved through education. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're certainly speaking to my heart. Tag, okay, you're the last guy. What's the bottom line for Sudan? What can you offer?
I think the bottom line is the logical start of having peace that is implementable, a peace agreement that is implementable on the ground. The process that was hosted by the government of South Sudan, with all good intentions, the party that was in charge of mediation did not have a clue about political settlements before they embarked on this exercise. There was quite a bit of a chaos and mess at the beginning. And the declaration of principles, which is what we are going to talk about, what are the issues, what do you need to resolve, that was extremely poorly formulated. And I remember in the comprehensive peace agreement, political issues were put at the forefront of the declaration of principles until we consulted with the International Institute for Strategic Affairs in London, Klingendale, and Max Planck. And they suggested that security issues come in the forefront. Now, the other party, the rebels, would never have agreed to do that, because those who were negotiating in Juba were generals without privates. They did not have presence on the ground. The two parties that have presence and have got guns and have got personnel trained are not in these parties. So at the end of the day, it became an issue of how many seats do we get in the federal government and how many seats do we get locally. So I don't think that we have a real, true, viable, enforceable, implementable peace agreement. And I see this as an important starting point for the people of Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you.